Welcome to Acid Horizon on Zero and Repeater. Today we're doing something kind of interesting, kind of special, something I'm very excited about. I went to my first conference in a long time last weekend. I signed on to Zoom to see this beautiful guy present on another beautiful man, Max Stirner. Now, I am a first time reader of Max Stirner. He has floated in anarchist circles for so long. He has an almost comical, but almost insurmountable online presence as the sort of stand in for what has become uh, individualist anarchism or egoism. So, Adam presented a paper at the first annual Union of Stirners conference at Duquesne University, my alma mater, a place that I learned about Gilles Deleuze, Michel Foucault, and Hegel and Heidegger. I received my, philosophical education there. So it was very special to see a really good friend of mine who I work with extensively go to the place where I received my philosophical foundation. But the paper was awesome. And it is up on, if you know anything about Adam's work, Happy Hour at Hipples, a very particular version of it. We'll get to that later. But I just wanted to introduce Adam. You all know him already. He does far more for this than I do. But yeah, so let's just jump right into the questions. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this kind of strange one-on-one discussion on Stirner at such short notice.
I'm relatively not as self-centered as most egoistic scholars would like to present themselves, but it's always good to actually just sit down and finally get some Stirner out of there because there's so many misconceptions and there's so many bullshit readings of Stirner. Not in the academy so much. I mean, we saw this at the conference. Like, it was so refreshing, but he's such he's so memeified
Yeah.
that often he can be reduced to sort of the childish anarchists that lives in the heads of some of the less charitable fellow Marxist comrades of ours.
Yeah, the depiction of anarchism that the strict Engelsian would carry, right? So let's jump right into it. And I think we should start with the very basics. But the very basics, right, are perhaps what's under assault in the unique and its property. Let's start with the question that Stirner would probably detest the most, which would be, who is he? Who is Max Stirner?
Well, sadly for Max Stirner, he's inspired such a kind of a fandom, even from the couple of decades after his death, that he is the only young Hegelian member of that circle of whom we have a complete biography written. So it's a shame there. But Max Stirner is the pen name of a man named Johann Caspar Schmidt, who was born in 1806, around the same year that Hegel wrote The Phenomenology of Spirits, and died around, late 1840s, early 1850s, apparently of an insect bite. He had an atrocious life. He started off relatively okay, worked in a girls' school, got his teaching credit around the 1830s, I believe, or even probably a little bit earlier, when he got his work at the gymnasium. He did attend Hegel's lectures in 1828 and 1827. So he attended lectures on the philosophy of Geist, so his lectures on psychology, his lectures on the ages of man, his lectures on the philosophy of history he also attended, and therefore got a sense of like the Hegelian scheme, like how reason develops through history, and also Hegelian psychology, Hegelian history, Hegelian theory of religion. And then he also took another course in 1841, which is much more interesting, which is he took a course with a guy called Karl Werder. Now, in the 1840s, Hegel was not in fashion as he is today. You know, he's not the he's not the it girl we know and love him as. Teaching Hegel was seen as kind of a political attack because it was seen as atheistic, or even worse for the time in Germany, pantheistic. And if he was going to go into the academy to teach Hegel, it might be your last time teaching. And Karl Werder was mainly a sort of a Shakespeare scholar, but he taught a class in 1841. He went back to the academy to teach Hegel, basically as kind of an opening salvo of an attack against the academy itself. And he was going to teach Hegel's logic, based on the theory that nothingness, not being, not pure being, as the science logic really starts with, but nothingness is the ground of Hegel's logic. And we could talk a bit about this class for ages, because this class has everyone in it. It had Turgenev, the person who would go on to coin nihilism in his book Fathers and Sons. It had Bakunin, it had Kierkegaard, it had Engels, and of course Max Stirner. All in the same class, all getting the Hegelian logic from the same nihilistic proto-young Hegelian Karl Werder. But 1841, he's already in Berlin at that point, moved out from Bayreuth, and he eventually, 1843, comes into the circle called Die Freien, or the Free, who we now know as the young Hegelians. So Bruno Bauer, his brother Edgar, Ludwig Feuerbach, Sezeliger somewhat, Moses Hess, Friedrich Engels. Marx really wasn't on the scene at this point. Him and Stern never met. But this was a crew of, it's something to say revolutionary thinkers. A lot of these people were Hegelian academics who had either moved from the right end of Hegelianism to the left end, like Bauer, or they were just Hegelian academics who were basically in their sort of pre-revolutionary radicalism, because the 1848 revolutions were a few years away, as they call it, the Vormers period. We're trying to use Hegel to basically be a stand-in for a think of the French Revolution as it would reoccur in Germany. But these are mostly groups of disaffected academics and social radicals. I mean, we had Bruno Bauer, who most people will probably only know because he wrote the article Die Judenfrage, which is the Jewish question, which Marx responds to in On the Jewish Question. Ludwig Feuerbach, of course, most people will know because of Marx's theses on Feuerbach, wrote a book called Das Wesen des Christentums, the essence of Christianity, and the philosophy of the future. You don't need to put that in the German. And Moses Hess, who wrote one of the first socialist pamphlets in Germany, The Holy History of Mankind, later becomes an adherent of Marx's, and in his own time, at least, a very strong founder of ideas of what would then go on to be called Labour Zionism, or the left wing of Zionism, as contentious as any sort of leftist formulation of that ideology could be. But Stirner is entering the scene. He's formulating his ideas about this wider literary scene he's in. He writes an article in 1842, 43, called Die Freien, the Free Ones, and he describes their principle of action as, well, the principle of their philosophy as autonomy of the spirit. He enters the circle, he enters their debating sort of scene, which happens in the back room of a wine bar, a Weinstube, called Hippel's, which is on Friedrichstrasse in Berlin. Not anymore, it's gone. But this is where all of the arguments they had, and of course in their journals, in the Rheinische Zeitung, which is the magazine that Marx edited, Stirner published early articles. And then eventually all culminates in 1844 with the book, The Unique and Its Property, or the German is Der Einzige und sein Eigentum, erroneously translated since 1905 as The Ego and Its Own. Der Einzige does not mean ego. There is egoism in Stirner, there is no ego. And this is really sort of where Stirner gets his name from, the one book. He wrote another one. It was more of like a compilation he edited, but this is the one book, effectively known as the Ego book. So that's Stirner's sort of life, career, and the reasons why we know who he is. And of course, this can't go without saying we mostly know Stirner because of Marx and Engels' huge attack on him in what we know as the German ideology, but it's just called Sankt Max, the nickname they gave him, where they think he's the real enemy, not Feuerbach or Bauer, but he is the real obstruction to the formulation of materialism that they want to put forward.
Yeah, interestingly enough, and we'll get to this question of the relationship between Marx and Stirner, and perhaps Stirner's position as a kind of repository for attack, as a sort of figure in the history of philosophy that is a kind of negative image from Marx and Feuerbach all the way through to Guy Debord, right? And eventually Foucault and Agamben, who have, I think, a very different view of the function of Stirner in the history of philosophy. But again, that's pretty repressed in the in the scholarship of those latter two figures. I think it's quite fascinating that that Stirner is labeled and maintained as a kind of young Hegelian But given what we know about that moment or that series of events or emergences in the history of philosophy, right, where the self-analysis of the West is one that takes place on Judeo-Christian terms, often anti-Semitic terms, right, and eventually shifts uh, to at least with the Feuerbachian move, and then eventually shifts in the opposite direction towards the analysis of the category of capitalism that would essentially prevail in the Germanic self-analysis or German philosophical analysis of the West. Max Stirner, alongside Feuerbach and others, has been labeled one of these young Hegelians. But given what we know about German idealism, where does Saint Max fit into the discussion between the Feuerbachians, Bruno, Marx, Engels, and so on?
So, so Stirner, I mean, and Jakob Blumenfeld pointed us out at the conference actually, who also have a great book on Zero Books about Stirner. That Stirner does actually respond to Marx. This is the Marx of the paper, on the Jewish question, because the main camps of German idealism at this time, at least in the scenes that Max Stirner was talking about, you had the right Hegelians, who are essentially on the back foot. Schelling has been sent into the academy to excoriate the dragon seed of Hegelian pantheism. Hegelianism is on the way out. The right Hegelians want to say that. They're what Larry Stepelevich, who's a great scholar of this, calls accommodationists. We can make Hegel accommodate to the religion of today. Be it Christianity, as in the German, particularly the Prussian state, because Germany is a unified nation state here. And I must just tell you the whole story. So the editor of the second edition of Hegel's Lectures on the Philosophy of Religion is the young rising star of these bright, very institutional Hegelians. Now, his name is Bruno Bauer. Now, Bruno Bauer is basically sent to respond to a work of someone who is also usually associated with the young Hegelian movement, despite the fact he was never part of the circle in Berlin. That's a guy called David Strauss. So David Strauss writes a book called The Life of Jesus Critically Examined, says he invents sort of a historical biblical criticism and says, if you look at the historical data, Jesus was just a guy, he didn't do anything miraculous, he doesn't exist. And he's claiming a kind of Hegelian lineage when he does this. The right Hegelians suddenly go, okay, look, Bruno, we're going to send you to read his book, and then what you're going to do is you're going to show Hegel's dialectical logic in a way that shows that you can dialectically deduce all of the biblical stories, the whole biblical narrative from a dialectical logic, and therefore sort of show it to be metaphysically true. The problem with this is that Bauer does do this, but then he realizes that actually it's not that the Bible is dependent. It's not that the dialectical logic is dependent upon the Bible. The Bible is actually dependent on dialectical Hegelian logic, and therefore the Hegelian dialectic, the dialectic of historical self-consciousness, supersedes the Bible, and therefore the essence of religion is revealed to be the essence of a critical human self-consciousness. Now that's when Bauer completely flips, loses teaching position, anonymously writes a text called I'm not translating it I'm not going to say it in the German, I can't remember the full title, but it's got an amazing title. It's The Trumpet of the Last Judgment Against Hegel, the Atheist and Antichrist. Now, this is the book that really launches that young Hegelian, the left Hegelian thing, where he says that Hegel actually was a French revolutionary sympathizer, and he wanted to do this grand terror of dissolving all of the old institutions of the state before the critical self-consciousness. This was kind of like a new atheism of its day. Like a big of Bauer's like a Christopher Hitchens. Exactly as that's actually a pretty much isomorphism there. So that's where the first main pole of the Hegelian scene comes in. Second pole is Feuerbach. Feuerbach is kind of old money. Feuerbach's dad is criticized as he's a legal theorist, and he's criticized by Hegel in a philosophy of right. Nonetheless, Feuerbach sees Hegel as a kind of a second father figure, writes him these lovely letters, has the same kind of a very similar kind of idea as for Bauer, which is the essence of God is just the essence of man. All the qualities we love about God are actually just the qualities of man extended into infinity, and therefore, in order to eliminate the alienation we have, we need to rename everything, don't have a Christian state, but have a universalist humanist state, where you all, instead of having the essence of God, we have the essence of man. So we have sort of this critical sort of new atheist style Bauerian sort of post-theology. He's actually called by Arnold Rude, another one of the young Hegelians, who I forgot to mention. He's called the Robespierre of theology, this theological terrorist. Then we have Ludwig Feuerbach. And he even says basically the word renaming. He wants to rename the Christian state the humanist state, and basically he thinks that we all know on our heart of hearts that there's a humanist, that we're only worshipping the human species, we're only doing everything for the human species. We should have a revolution, overthrow Christianity, put man in God's place. This is the scene that Stirner enters upon. And Stirner's, when he first enters it, he's fully paid into this. He thinks autonomy of the spirit. He writes these papers like Art and Religion, where he thinks that that religion is incompatible with rational freedom, because it does ultimately supersede it. And he's fully into this sort of milieu until something breaks. I think he finally meets them in person in 1843, 44, and he just sits there listening, occasionally chiming in, and just sort of biding his time. He keeps telling people he's got this magnificent book he keeps in his drawer somewhere, but he's still very friendly with them. I mean, the young Hegelians marry him and his second wife, Mary Dernhardt, who gave him a lot of money. She funded the milk shop that him and Bauer tried to do, this sort of like anarchist cooperative. It was probably like quite a fun time to be in Berlin, actually.
Yeah, it seems frankly, it seems like it. There's this one passage early in The Unique and Its Property where Stirner suggests that there's in fact a kind of desperation in Feuerbach's maneuver to sort of seek out and retain the highest dogmatics of Christian living and pull it down to the human being. And in a certain sense, he's like, no, 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 no. Like this is not an atheism. In fact, it is a remarkable and violent dogmatism. Um, but I'm wondering now, because you've given us a really, I think, a fantastic, and I've learned a lot, a fantastic history of the young Hegelians. I'm wondering now if you could speak specifically to Stirner's relationship with Hegel, like because one of the most important things, right, is for all of these theorists is the access that they had to particular works of Hegel, right? So like it's important to know, for example, that Marx got as a gift Bakunin's copies of the Logic, right? Also kind of violent if you think about the relationship that they had. Bakunin's old copies, he gets to finally take them from him. But what was Stirner's relationship to Hegel in his access to Hegel's work and the way in which Hegel registered with his intellectual development?
So when he starts writing in sort of the early to mid 1820s, his first paper is his doctoral, or it's a thesis you have to write for a teaching qualification. It's called Über Schulgesetz. It's basically on the rules of the school, and it's very Hegelian in the sense of this idea of people have to be developed. They are fundamentally like seeds. You have to sort of unfold and envelop them, and to do this, they need to submit themselves to a power which sort of develops them at the same time as they develop themselves, and then they can sort of come out and be independent by cultivating what Hegel calls a second nature, good habits, where your particular desires become interwoven with a wider universal sort of process, which is the universal process of the institutions of society that you're born into. And in his early days, Stirner's pretty much entirely brought up with this. His first writings on education are pretty orthodox Hegelian, because Hegelianism is the orthodoxy of its time, at least for those 20 years before Schelling is brought in. And I think Schelling's stuff is actually very interesting here, but let's bracket that out. When it comes to the time of The Unique and Its Property, Stirner has rejected Hegelianism. Not in the sense, because there's so just to clarify for the listeners, there's been this tradition to identify Stirner as the consummating figure to use the meme, he completed the system of German idealism. And this was a sort of a point of my research for a long time. Um, and the best articulator of this in English is Larry Sepelevic, who basically says that Stirner he consummates the ending of the phenomenology of spirit, he consummates the system. This appears well in Karl Lewif, his book from Hegel to Nietzsche. Stirner's in there and says, like, yeah, this guy completes Hegel. Guy Deleuze in Nietzsche and Philosophy says Stirner completes Hegel by reducing it to a pure I equals I sort of masturbatory egoism, or more technically, a masturbatory negativity. I've been trying this for years. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because Stirner believes that the principle of Hegelianism is an autonomy of the spirit, and he doesn't believe in autonomy in the sense that putting yourself under a law by externalizing yourself in order to return yourself to yourself.
We can also just
He
say
doesn't
that
believe in the philosophy of right either. He says that Hegel's system is the greatest violence of thought and its highest despotism. Now, he does say in a review of Bauer's book on Hegel that Hegel actually has no problem with this. Hegel was given man the tools to free themselves. But the problem with this is that this thesis, yes, he says that once, then he goes to meet Bauer and Feuerbach and that in person, then he changes his mind and sort of they become his philosophical enemies. Not necessarily the personal enemies, because they had a great friendship, especially between the Bauer brothers and Engels and Stirner. But he breaks with Hegel, but he nonetheless uses a lot of Hegelian themes he took from the lectures. So the first half of the uniqueness property is called man. And anyone who's sort of been, because he's writing for an audience of people who've seen Hegel speak. The problem is that he's doing this more or less to sort of present their own logic to them in a way which makes it seem kind of silly. And this is where it gets very, very counterproductive. And sometimes I'm still writing on this particularly very bad. So there are some examples of this. So he uses Hegel's theory of the stages of life, child, adolescence, adults, and then sort of how Hegel characterizes them. And he tries to subvert them for his own theory of child psychology, which we'll probably get to later. But he also tries to think of providing a Hegelian-style religious history of how different religions develop into their various others. And then that also corresponds to Hegel's lectures on the philosophy of religion. So Stirner would have had access to, at the very least, all the lectures he attended, because a lot of them were circulating at that time, especially through Bruno Bauer. The logic, or at least Karl Werder's textbooks on the logic. And we know this because he had conversation with Engels, and Engels recounts them in letters that they had conversations about the science of logic. He would have probably also had a collection of the encyclopedia. So that presents all of Hegel's late system.
Essentially, now that we have an account of Stirner's relationship to Hegel, we now kind of have to get into the weeds of particularly the most important functions of Hegelian philosophy politically in the history of political administration, the history of a theory of sovereignty, of a theory of right, of the theory of the civil society, which are all very important to Hegel's political work. So in your piece, you kind of touch on this, that in a lot of engagements with Stirner, like Sepelevich, for example, notably, Stirner is treated as someone who completes a system or comes in and solves a problem, but in a sense is always submitted to their account of the history of philosophy, is always submitted to the fundamental commitments of a Hegelian history of philosophy, and particularly to Hegel's philosophy of right. Everything from his account of the person to civil society. Given that the word property in the more mimetic samplings that we get of Stirnerian intensity on the internet or among anarchists, given that the word property plays an important role there and in the text, can you give an account of what Stirner means by that word? Because in some ways, the foundation of the civil society and its relation, importantly, to the state in Hegel's philosophy of right, the real important thing here is the philosophically bourgeois notion of property. That plays an important role. And if Stirner, well, first of all, does Stirner have a theory
Mm.
of property in the conventional sense? And is it a theory of property that we could understand through juridicality, through capital L law, through deduction?
Well, let's start with Hegel's theory of property. So, a lot of the people who would want to make sort of a parallel between Stirner and Hegel will typically turn to the first part of the Hegelian theory of right, which you'll find in the Encyclopedia, Part 3, The Philosophy of Geist, or in the opening sections of the book itself, which expands on that, outlines or elements of the philosophy of right. Now, the first part is called abstract right, and that begins with it. So it begins where the last parts of the system left off, which is the production of a free will. Now, what does the free will do? The free will wills the free will, but let's bracket that out for a bit. What abstract right does is abstract right wants to affirm its identity. It wants to affirm itself by, essentially the idea is, I know myself as free. How do I express myself that I'm free? I am free to appropriate anything around me and take it within myself. I am free to appropriate, and I can say that thing is mine, and because I can sort of mark myself on it, by saying it's mine, my individuality, which is my capacity to own property, and my capacity to externalize myself in the world, to actually have a being in the world, a Dasein, a being there, shines back to me. The problem for that, for Hegel, is that, well, the thing can only shine it back to you so much. And the thing is, it's very much similar to the master slave dialect. The thing can only shine back so much. You need something which is just like you in order to show, to recognize you again. Because who else is going to know what it's like to own property better than something else that can own property? And so fundamentally, owning things is only possible, and therefore being, having an individual being in this world is only possible through being recognized by another owner. And of course, this is how you make contracts. Because by making a contract with the other person, you can, of course, alienate your property, you can exchange stuff. And insofar as you can exchange it, be recognized as being the kind of thing that can make exchanges, you are recognized by the other person, the other party, as someone who can own something, insofar as you've given it away. And you recognize them as a sort of person that can own things by giving things to them and making them their property. Of course, contracts always have disputes, and therefore we need a third party which mediates all such disputes, regardless of the particular character of the people who are disputing any contract, but because these particular characters can dispute in the first place. And therefore, the particularity of any two people in a contract is preserved in the institution which adjudicates the contract. The negation is negated, the particularity is taken as a moment of the process of adjudication, and we have the first kinds of judiciaries. And this is the elementary idea that you need institutions to mediate between particulars, and therefore the particulars, insofar as they recognize each other and the institution, can all fulfill their particular desires, their individual desires, which is for Hegel the desire to confirm oneself and one's being in the world, one's existence through externalizing oneself and realizing oneself and actualizing oneself through these universal institutions. Now, if Stirner believed in that, he would be a tied-up Hegelian. He would have no reason to call for an insurrection because he would be within the ethical substance and the custom of his world, and he wouldn't see anything wrong with that. He does, and therefore he doesn't believe in what Hegel calls right. And that process I'm describing is the element of right. The zone of right. So right in German doesn't just mean rights, like human rights, but also rights, the right of way, the right of passage, like law itself and correctness. Element of custom as well. And of course, we have to think that Germany has a very developed legal infrastructure because of the Holy Roman Empire didn't have a high development of anything else. If you want to think about it in paradox terms, they put a lot of money into administration. Now, Stirner does not believe that property has anything to do with owning things. Now, that's quite unusual. Stirner does not believe property has anything. He says, my property is not an external thing independent of me. Property has nothing to do with, I go find Like I see a cup and I sort of go take hold of it and I go, this is mine. I imprint myself upon it, and and such that my ability to own things is what I imprint, and if I give this away to someone, my ability to own things is still recognized by them and be able to give it away. There is fundamentally for Hegel, the property is a logic of self-realization in which you need to be recognized and confirmed in the other. And therefore, this universal pattern of recognition justify the institutions, justify the property, justify the exchange, and justify one's property over things, fixed objects, independent property. Stirner does not believe in right. Stirner does not believe that one can ever own something by right of logic alone. He believes people can only own things by what he calls Macht, force, power, might, maybe. Does this mean that Stirner is a might makes right guy? If so, Rousseau has already got his number. Doesn't make any sense. You can't have right if might makes right. Stirner does not believe in right, therefore he does not believe in might makes right. Property is, however, is not a thing. So if property is not a thing, then what is it? It's power, okay. Power is not a thing, so what is it then? Property for Stirner is an empowerment of you. It is what empowers you. And this is a pun on property and properties, The property of the table is that it had 4 legs, say, and it is my property if I use it, take hold of it, and use it, put my laptop on like I'm doing now. So Stirner does not have a theory of property based on any kind of right or logical consequence or logical inference, because he does not believe property is anything. You do not own anything by means of an argument alone. You own things by means of a force of that argument, or force generally, which establishes the very conditions of the discursive acceptability in which an argument becomes feasible. Because you can be free to disagree with the court all you want. You can do that. If you want to do anything about the courts, then force will be applied to you. So Stirner's theory of property, he does not have so the question that would go after this is, does he have a theory of power? The answer is no. There have been some brilliant ways in which you can find a theory of power in Stirner. So, for example, Jakob Blumenfeld, again to mention his book is probably the best theory of Stirnerian power I think you could possibly get, which is a theory of power through Spinoza. The problem with that, I believe, is that it's very good at explaining it. There's nothing wrong with Jakob's way of doing it. I just don't agree with the methodology, because Spinoza is a thinker of principles and philosophical principles, and Stirner explicitly rejects the idea of having any principles or axioms. So I think with Stirner, ultimately, I'm not going to sell to the audience Stirner as a philosopher. No, he's a thinker of refusal. And I think what's interesting about him is when he refuses to provide accounts of, for example, power. Because if he was going to provide accounts of power, we know what accounts of power do. They split humans up into gradations and abilities and constitute disabilities on that basis. Stirner is not interested really in this distinction. He does have a theory of madness, and that madness is to be captured within such binaries and discourses and really believe that they're real. The idea, quintessential kind of madness where someone believes they're Napoleon. Well, the judge might believe he's a judge. He actually has these magic words that can do things, and of course he does in the sense of performativity. But Stirner is not going to give a theory of power on this basis, because power is not a question to be solved by any kind of philosophical quantification. Given he says in The Uniqueness Property, the workers have the utmost power in their hands. All they would need to do is withdraw their labor, and the state is lost. This is not a theory of power in the sense of, here's how we can quantify how much power. Power does not need right of argument or right of quantification in order to speak. Power speaks when the world stops. Power speaks when the docks are, when your ports are blocked. Power speaks when your king is hanging by a noose. Power does not speak by right of argument this is different in a course, in a sense, in a democratic society when words have power, but if you take away the police protections of, Rupert Murdoch or someone, the power of words may not be a little bit shattered by this. As Stirner says, freedom of the press is not actually freedom of anyone um, in themselves in that society. It's the freedom of an apparatus. So does Stirner have a fear of property? No. But if you think about property as empowerment rather than things, then the idea that there's this joke that Stirner will say to a person that you are my property. That means that you empower me. It avoids the idea of property or the sort of the colonialism of property that we get with someone like Aimé Césaire, who in his discourse on colonialism looked at thingification. Stirner, his entire view of property is against the thingification that pins people down into properties, branded elements of bourgeois society.
In some ways, there's kind of two figures here that I think are helpful. First are strangely the Franciscans, right, and their notion of the highest poverty, right, where the Franciscans develop a theory of the refusal of ownership, right, as foundational to their theory of property, right. Agamben writes about the Franciscans that just as the horse eats oats without having right to them, so do the Franciscans use what they need, right? And it becomes a real problem for papal authority, right? This abdicatio iuris. Uh, and, the other figure that I think is really important here, which we'll get to, is a kind of strange proximity to a particular French theorist who would come, over 100 years later and refuse a conception of power as a substance or something reducible to a force or a principle or an axiom, and yet is often reduced to it. Right? What does Edward Said reduce Foucault to? Wrongly, a Spinozist. What does Antonio Negri reduce Foucault to? Incorrectly, a Spinozist. So there's this desire to maintain some sort of grounding, some grounding principle, namely and importantly, a naturalizing one, right? Grounded in a sort of necessity to represent the world in such a way that it could not be otherwise, that persists, it seems, in this Stirnerian scholarship. Now, you've kind of already answered this question here in the expansive account that you just provided. But I still want to touch on it just because I think that it's a word that comes up a lot in those early pages. And what I want this episode to be is someone who can now just go open the book and be a little less terrified, right? So that they have some, unfortunately, anchoring points, right, to guide their way through this. So I'm going to ask a basic question. What is the fixed idea? And what is Stirner's relation to the function of the human in the history of philosophy, right? What is he doing in that section on man?
So, the fixed idea, it's an old term for madness, really. He says he first invokes it in the French, idée fixe, like that. I apologize, my French is far worse than my German. So Stirner is writing this book primarily against the Bauer and Feuerbach, so I say against Hess, against humanism generally, because the idea is that we have this great humanist discovery is that we have discovered man for the first time. He's God. He's the critical self-consciousness that we ascribe to God. And we need a revolution to replace God with man, have this great humanist, somewhat socialist, this is a pre-Marxian kind of socialism society. Stirner says, look, Feuerbach has literally said that he's just renaming the current order of things. The same hierarchical structure by which the universal, an abstract universal, such as the human species, will therefore pose itself as fundamentally opposed to particular, is maintained. The freedom of the people is not my freedom, because the people is not a person. It is none of these people. And Stirner fundamentally does not agree with the idea that there is a sublation that occurs here. There is always an outside to the sublation. And yes, this may end up in a bad infinity, but I mean, life is a bad infinity. We die at the end. I mean, yes, life is a bad infinity. This is a problem for Hegelians because they need things to line up in like a nice little circle, but there is also a bad infinity to constantly trying to sublate the bad infinity into a good infinity. This is why we have a Hegel revival and constant people trying to say that everything is Hegelian when it isn't, because Hegel himself is a bad infinity by means of his students. Fundamentally, you need a way to refuse Hegel in order to do anything else. Now, the problem that can usually mean just saying Hegel's right, yep, the system's closed, you can go do something else. But Stirner's, the first part of the book is called On Man, Der Mensch, and he's going to use a bunch of their own tools, somewhat against them, somewhat playfully. So the first time, this is where we get the fixed idea, is in the section called Ein Menschenleben, a human life or a man's life. And he goes from, it's somewhat autobiographical. You start off as a child. The child is full of desires. It wants to reach out and grab stuff, appropriate it, eat. It needs to feed. It needs to play. Not very good at doing this, of course. But the first sort of pushback it ever gets in the world is parental discipline when it's a toddler. Now, it's like, he's Stirner's in this sort of mode of, the first thing a kid wants to do is assert itself or empower itself, gain property in the world, enjoy itself. Well, it can't do that. The parents, the disciplinary rod, puts an objective barrier between them. So that kind of provokes them to having to make other steps. What if he calls getting behind the object. So, I can outsmart them. I'm going to use my cunning, get round this objective barrier. Problem is, what do they encounter? Is that they encounter not simply not only another object, but rather the more times they do this, they encounter the objective rationality behind the objects. So, for example, going to church all the time, you're forced to eat the cracker and have a sip of the grape juice. You're forced to sing along really stupid hymns, and you think, I'm going to use my cunning to get behind this. Oh shit, I've got the entire system of Christianity, the theological system, the essence, the ideal of God made flesh who died and resurrected. Or, I'm forced to wear this stupid little cadet uniform, sing the Pledge of Allegiance, and of course I'm going to be behind this, but actually behind this you find the ideal, the objective structure and the objective logic of patriotism itself. And the idea is that these ideas become fixed insofar as they capture you. They're basically a way of, they're a failed escape. A fixed idea is a failed escape. A fixed idea is basically an ideological device which is sort of conditioned into you from adolescence, or kind of any age really, in which you're particularly plastic. And it reroutes your desires to empower yourself into a mode that only empowers the systems around you. And you may get some empowerment from this. This is what he calls unfreiwilliger Egoismus, or which is like involuntary egoism. I think you can actually describe it as subjective desire. But what it is, it's like a negative feedback mechanism. So it basically pushes against, through guilt, the idea of doing anything for yourself or doing anything like for you in your very particular mode of being, and instead redirects you towards the universal end of, family, fatherland, God, and etc. And of course, it does give you enjoyment for this, but this enjoyment is actually counter to the very operation. So every time you enjoy, for example, you enjoy doing something charitably, you feel bad about it. Something like that. They're basically, it's an ideological device which tries to keep you acting in such a way that your own particular desires end up reinforcing the objective structures around you. It's basically a kind of cybernetic psychological economy. Now, Stirner's sort of theory of maturity here, because the fixed idea comes in at it's conditioned into you from childhood, reaches its heights in adolescence, and eventually, around maturity, you kind of burn yourself out and you reach what Hegel calls maturity, which is where more or less the indoctrination of society, the ideological patterns of societal action become second nature to you. If they don't, Hegel says they should be sent off to America. And a lot of ideologues of German colonialism thought this too. Colonialism was actually to save people from being wasted in their own society, quote unquote. And they say they want to find an America for them, where they can recreate the German normality further away. Now, that's the first use. That's where the fixed idea comes from. The second use, he gives a history of religion, more or less straight out of Hegel. And Hegel's lectures on spirit and the philosophy of religion. The idea that, Christianity was itself a kind of atheism, a negation of other religions, or Christianity and Judaism, were negations of pagan religions, negations of Socrates. They were following this kind of typical line of development. And of course, at the end of it, we have Christianity. The Christianity that Feuerbach believes in, the Christianity that Bauer believes in, which really has humans at the end of it. That's overthrown. Pretty boring section. Then we have the hierarchy, which begins with 2 paragraphs of this racial hierarchy that Hegel gives, which is essentially, he called, basically blackness, Africanness, Far East Mongolian Empire, Chinese, developments of religion, and then the Caucasian. Now, is Stirner using these in any sort of literal sense? No. Does it matter in terms of, the question is not, did Stirner say racist things? This is a complete non-question. Of course he did. We can see them. Young Hegelianism was not a racist movement. Young Hegelianism was not an anti-racist movement. It produced some of the most theologically tinged racisms or anti-Semitisms of that period, which many people would have actually rightfully fought against, but these people didn't. This isn't something we should be particularly squeamish about. The question for me is, does that mean that the egoist character has an inherent whiteness to it? I don't think so. I think it would if he carried on with the Hegelian anthropology he's sticking with, but ultimately he is making a incredibly immoral joke and to try and take the piss out of the Hegelian anthropological discourses which he's already intervening in. This is a kind of baggage from his teaching, a baggage from his audience, but ultimately, I don't think it bleeds into the more political outputs of the second part of the book, because fundamentally Stirner rejects any account of man, and he doesn't reject it on the basis that the sort of man that he is the German man who can reject this. Fundamentally, what he's doing is he's basically calling them to try and fulfill their own ideologies, but of course they can't. But I mean, there's been some discourse on this, not enough, really, not enough, because David Leopold obviously doesn't really develop it very much. Cedric Robertson has a discussion of Stirner quite extended in the book, The Terms of Order, but this isn't very much mentioned. But nonetheless, he does conclude rightly that Stirner and the egoists generally are very limited by European worldview. Pretty much, this is a guy who didn't read particularly widely in the times in which he was reading this, and he was writing for a specific audience, the audience of, as I said, profound Hegelian racialists. This is not something we should get too hung up on, unless we can find a connection which causes us to challenge it. And I invite the listener who's going to read this, keep that in mind, because Hegelian racialism is still something we haven't really properly understood in terms of its implications. Not because of any sort of, get rid of Hegel, but because, no, if it's there, it's there. And someone like Ray Tirada has done some really fantastic work unearthing this, particularly in the context of left Hegelianism. So we have that interaction with Stirner, with Hegel's account of man. And then, really, by the end of it, he's evacuated. By the second half of the book, he's evacuated all of this. The end of the first part of the book is ending with him doing a political debate against, he calls, 3 kinds of liberalism: critical, which is Bauer, sort of liberal, which is Hegel, and humane, social, which is Hess, to some extent Marx as well, and his theory of socialism, and humane, which is Feuerbach. These are all the same argument, more or less, which is you're just replacing one joint abstraction with another, and each was going to come with revolutionary terror, which will not achieve its own aims because it cannot undermine its own dialectic. The point is to not complete the dialectic, but to refuse outright and destroy the conditions of possibility of that very system, which you cannot do philosophically. So in terms of Hegel's account of man, there's some psychological theses there I think it's good to unearth. Some other stuff which might carry some philosophical baggage, but I don't think it does, purely because of Stirner's refusal later on. And some of it which is purely just him trying to reel people in, because these sort of philosophical and anthropological histories are pretty much baked into that structure of philosophy. And it's not to say I'm to minimize any of this, but nonetheless, we should know when bringing it up is helpful in a discourse, not necessarily productive, but literally helpful in terms of textual accuracy, and whether or not it's just something that it causes a kind of blockage which won't help us understand the text, even when it may actually end up in these worse areas.
Yeah, Césaire, um, Membe's critique in Necropolitics of Hegel's philosophy of right is also really helpful here. We'll probably cover Necropolitics at some point on Acid Horizon because it's a work of biopolitical philosophy that I think is important. Um, but it's got a lot going on in that text. So yeah, that's all really helpful. The next question is looking now to the fundamental contributions. Well, contribution is a strange word for Stirner, right, in the history of philosophy, because I think he's a little bit more destructive than he is uh, positive. But here's a concept that is central to the work that you do, at least early in your dissertation period, that I think maybe will help us here, which is just what are we to understand uh, by Stirner when he speaks of the notion of the creative nothing. We've seen a lot of different accounts of the creative nothing, right? Some even now coming from Catherine Malibu. Um, you know, is this a posited arche or a sovereign foundation through which we get a conception of political subjectivity? Be that a classically anarchist one, like of the platform, or a Proudhonist or Bakuninian uh, uh, depiction? Is it something through which we can understand experience through space-time, or even, let's say, something like very loosely, a unity of apperception? Is it something like that, or is it something completely different?
So it's nothing. So I did write a lot on this. I did use those words through the stuff I was talking about earlier with Hegelian nihilism to build up an entire theory of Hegel's theory of logic as this kind of insurgent core which bursts out at the end, and that's where Stirner is. Then that was a very innovative aspect, and I don't think it works, but I think the benefits of the term "the creative nothing" in German, "et schöpferische Nichts," is yeah, very great speech impediment to say it out as words. But the creative nothing is a space I think where it's best left to the reader. I think it's a space where people could actually have some great creative innovation. But what does Stirner mean by it? Absolutely nothing, or nothing which he's hinting at. Because so the term occurs twice in Die Uniqueness Property. Neither doesn't occur before or after. Talks of Engels. He recounts that Stirner gives up using Hegel's logic as a basis for any of this kind of work. When Stirner is responding to critics in the paper Stirner's Critics, it's not mentioned. It's not mentioned after that. I think it is meant to be this kind of textual void where it's sort of like, by what right do you do this? The creative nothing which cannot be captured in the text. This is what the unique is. I mean, the unique is basically a limit condition of thought, or a limit condition of what can be described in thought. It is something incredibly base, but not the lower part of any hierarchy. It is essentially a refusal to give an account of oneself. Because in those conditions, to give an account of oneself is to prepare oneself for a philosophical count, is to do a philosophical insurrection. Now, philosophical insurrection is self-defeating because philosophy, the only thing that philosophy is better at in insurrection is counterinsurgency. And therefore, why would you bother? I mean, Stirner even says to Feuerbach, these are only theological insurrections. You can do anything with words. Have the power of a lot of guns behind them. There was no point in really giving an account of oneself if one is preparing in the revolution moment that Stirner's writing about for something like this. You will know when it is over. When it is over, as Marx says, we'll make no excuses for the terror, which also means we're not going to send you a letter saying not giving you a petition. So the creative nothing, I think, is a beautiful space where the reader can really do some amazing philosophical work. But I don't think it means as much for Stirner. This is perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. I mean, for example, there's been some. We mentioned Catherine Malibu, Tim Elmo Phaeton. gave an amazing presentation on this, where he's using it as kind of a stand-in which brings Stirner into dialogue with kind of a dialectical systems theory, a plastic systems theory of integration with one's environment. And his work has been incredibly influential in how I understand property, particularly the spatial element of property, because the German word Eigentum, tum, is a it's like domicile, it's like Christendom, Christentum. There's a spatial element there. It's the space in which empowerment, the space in which we are empowered, as opposed to what Stirner wants to go against, which is what he calls society. Now, society for Stirner is very technical because he thinks about it in terms of the root of the word Gesellschaft in the word Saal, which is a word for like hall or a room, and Gesellschaft is the creation of a room which has like been made in the past and encloses you. So Eigentum is a kind of an empowerment without enclosure. This is why it's not bourgeois, nor is it fundamentally structured by the archaeology of any given or pre-existing system. It's only an insurrectionary gesture of thought, not a system and enclosure of thought itself.
Yeah, I almost feel like all of this, like, of course, like, guy who has only read Foucault, like, reads other philosopher for the first time. No, I mean, a lot of this seems to surround a really, really violent assault on Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, Hegel, in a way that is really, really reminiscent of what Foucault is doing with the notion of the historical a priori. And in fact, maybe there's a space for not just an account of Foucault's anarchism and Stirner's anarchism, but almost a methodological set of commitments or anti-methodological set of commitments, as it pertains to the relationship, to the very violent relationship that they have to this loose notion of the history of ideas, right? Um, so anyway, again, that's just 2 cents. Um, so now that we've got Stirner, let's talk a little bit more about, like, the specifics of your paper, and again, we will link, the playlist for all of the presentations at the Duquesne conference on Stirner. It's remarkable. I obviously suggest you check it out, um, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but in your paper, and this is a theorist who we've engaged with extensively, we have a reading group going on him, over on our Patreon. You connect Bataille's concept of base materialism or base matter to Stirner. Can you extrapolate on how you see, not just as it pertains to this kind of metaphysical or sort of metaphysical notion in in Bataille, not just that, but how Bataille and maybe even his notion of sovereignty and the rest, is fundamentally related, you think, to your reading of the ethic or even ontology of Stirner?
So, just to clarify in terms of any discussion I sort of give on Stirner and Bataille, I'm not trying to make Stirner a battalion, just to put him under the command of Bataille's that other can become shaped by that. I see them as comrades because they're both looking to escape the same thing. Bataille is trying to escape Hegelian anthropology, and then he's trying to find the kind of a matter which is not confined within discourse and the forces of enslavement and mastery which force them to stay in there. So base matter is a concept which doesn't really stay with Bataille for very long, and in my opinion at least, comes in this very short paper, Base Materialism and Gnosticism, which you get in Visions of Excess, amongst other collections. Base matter is essentially the insubordinate character of matter. He calls it a non-logical difference. The ultimate matter which is always different from any hierarchy or ideal, and indeed is the very thing which is based upon it. Ideals are constructed by humans, instructed by humans arranged in sort of modes of power, who arrange themselves in such modes of power. But fundamentally, the hierarchies or the binaries of high and low are actually based on something which is lower than low, a base matter which isn't even conceivable in those terms. And Stirner thinks about it in a similar way, because Stirner, he's a big partisan of the unmen, the inhuman. Because Stirner's fundamental argument is that humanization, the creation and policing about an ideal category of human qualities, therefore sets a decision in which things are outside of that boundary. The formation of a human creates the inhuman. However, all of us, by the abstract standards of this quality, are inhuman. The problem is that we're implanted with these fixed ideas which tell us that we need to realize these qualities in ourselves and become one with, the God man, the universal man. Problem is, if you take God out of that, you don't really have the whole eternal life thing that Kant needed to get you there as an assumption. You still act as if that's true, though, because it's just your programming for Stirner. Stirner's fundamental critique of humanism is that humanism creates dehumanization. The capital M human of the human species is no one, and also who the hell can speak for the species? And therefore, why can Feuerbach do this? Why can Kant do this? And this is why I think there's such a great coincidence with Stirner and Césaire, because Césaire's writing about French European humanism and colonial humanism and saying, look, by bigging yourselves up as this formal humanism, you've renounced your any duty to your own thoughts, and actually, because you think of yourselves as higher humans and thus as inhumans, then you can do whatever you want to us, and you dehumanize yourselves in fulfilling the directives of your so-called humanity. To quote Césaire, at the end of formal humanism and philosophical renunciation lies Hitler. When you start policing the boundaries of man, you make things of them both, and you make them objects to be controlled, dominated, and destroyed at will of these abstract ideals, these hegemonic ideologies which serve to reproduce a hegemonic objectivity and turn men into things. So, to conclude that thought, as I've just gone a little bit, the Stirnerian sort of rejection of humanism is fundamental to the whole project. He even says that the book is against humanism in a later article, not even about philosophy itself.
Yeah, I think in a certain sense this is really important, right? Because the the history of philosophy has always struggled with the anthropos, right? And the boundary of the anthropos. Well, not struggled. It's had a very fucking easy time producing a zone and state of exception. In fact, it revels in it, right? In the definition, extension, contraction, redefining of what constitutes the human being, right? And this is in a certain sense, like it's very telling that Agamben's work on this history, man and animal, his book The Open, right, which is in a certain sense a critical engagement with Heidegger, Bataille, Kojev, and it's a work of biopolitics at the same time. He opens with Kojev's uh uh or Bataille's tussle with Kojev in footnotes throughout their respective histories. Um and ends with an assertion that the establishing of an ontology is not an apolitical or uh prepolitical function, right? That ontology is frankly, what and how things constitute the real, right? So, for example, with Hegel, uh, there is no personage without the establishment of a theory of property, which necessitates a civil society, which necessitates a state to ensure it. Um, or for Marx, or for not for Marx, for Kant, right, the production of maxims and the capacity to produce maxims is essentially what allows for essential ethical human interaction, right? And Kant has a long history of remarkably ableist comments that certain theorists who are trying to save Kant desperately in a failed attempt, like Martha Nussbaum, even Jean Rawls, but Jean Rawls reproduces these problems, right? But anyway, so yes, I think what's really interesting here is Stirner's identification of humanism as the production of a state of exception, right, or of a zone of exception, or the boundary of the anthropos. But again, another episode, another discussion. So finally, and perhaps this is connected, and in fact, no, it is you spend some time taking a look at the relationship between anarchy and abnormality. Does Stirner have a theory of abnormality? And what does his account of insurrectionary anarchism have to do with it?
abnormality only in the sense of inhumanity, because he is the dialecticians will win this one, because insofar as he's using this language, he is tied up with the object he is attacking. That is not particularly a new or novel or interesting point. It's like saying, we are tied up with things we're attacking. Fantastic. Right.
Uninteresting
Um,
dialecticians? What?
yeah, it's fundamentally unserious point, but let's just return to it. The abnormality that Stirner is talking about is raw particularity, it's base particularity. It's the fact that you will never be fully encompassed by any categorization of you or flattening the map. It's very similar to saying the map is not the territory. And therefore, it's the enforcement of the map upon the territory, the categories onto things, is a space which requires a political contestation. It fundamentally requires political contestation, otherwise we surrender it to a false objectivity, and people get left by the wayside who are defined as abnormal in a kind of a second order sense. Because we're all abnormal, but declaring a zone of exception where there are degrees of separation which put you over the line, or even out of the category, out of the continuity, and therefore the community of the human entirely. Those are what Stirner's really scared of. I mean, you can see this actually in his critique of some of the other socialists of his time. So the socialist Wilhelm Weitling, he basically says that he quotes Weitling at length and says, and Weitling basically says, look, crime is something to be cured. And then Stirner says, my God, that's worse in a way. Like, the criminal at least has the dignity of a criminal, but crime and the cure are two sides of the same coin here. You're just actually entrenching the logic even further. And insofar as one considers, rather than a bad man, you are a sick man. Or who decides the sickness, who decides the boundaries of man, and what if this is actually us revolting against a society which needs to be revolted against? Now, of course, we don't have to say this is always necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's I have to treat my glass as a thing. Fair enough. That's not particularly what Stirner's going at. He's not giving a full category of thinghood or full explanation of thinghood. Ultimately, his refusal to do philosophy in these examples is the leaving open space for political, where philosophy can refuse to have, at least in the way he's thinking about philosophy, which is this. So Hegelian philosophy at the time is it's always heavily prescriptive, even when it's retrospective. It's like, okay, look, philosophy, as Hegel says, only shows up too late, but we still know from what came before that we have, achieved this greatness, and we know this dialectic. We know the institutions are present are justified. Things can change, but they will change under the gaze of the philosopher after this, or the established dialectician, and not until we have sort of sanctified it. That philosophy, in a sense, is an abnegation of the political, whereas Stirner really wants to leave open that space of raw contest. He wants to kind of throw a hand grenade into the discussion, and to that extent, this is one of the things I like about Stirner. He does kick philosophers out of philosophy a little bit. I mean, when the October Revolution happened, they didn't have to. They didn't sort of the October Revolution and the writing down the paper to like the Menshevik saying, "Fuck you, see, we did it." That paper was not itself the October Revolution. The mapping of it in a dialectical progression or philosophical argument is secondary to the taking of power through an agency, the proletariat, who don't need to speak. They simply take and they enjoy, and they expend their finite lives upon this earth in a manner which is, yes, maybe tied of what they're attacking, but what they're attacking deserves to be attacked because the thing's suppressing them. And if you have to keep attacking that again and again, then more power to you. Not to say that Stirner's a kind of Trotskyite permanent revolution theorist here. It's just his concerns are restricted to this opening up the space for the political and the insurrectionary to attack. Because the insurrection for Stirner is something which does not set itself on institutions, but is the constant struggle for self-arrangement. And that knackers people out, fair enough. But this is simply a gesture, I think, which is needed even to get to that point, even when we have to slow down eventually.
All right. Well, that's That's perfect, and that's a wrap. Again, I'd like to thank you for doing this on short notice. We literally I made these questions maybe 6 minutes before we pressed record or something, so this has all been very shotgun, but it's been a remarkable discussion. It's always a pleasure talking with you, Adam. I think you're a great scholar and an even better friend. So,
Oh, although thank you for the second part. A great scholar. I feel like I'm feeling a shot. So. And then again, it's okay. You're not going to see me throwing any bricks. At least not masked or anything for any of the officers watching. Because Stirnerians have always been seen as very dangerous, even by doctors. They used to do case studies on them.
yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah. Stirner actually appears in Nordau's account of degeneracy briefly, in relation to so we can talk about that some other time. Yeah. All right. Well, again, we will provide a link to Duquesne's remarkable conference on Stirner. We really hope that there is a subsequent annual union of Stirners, wherever and whomever may be able to host it. Perhaps I will submit a paper. Who knows? Now that I'm reading Stirner. So again, thank you so much. We'll put all of the links in the description to Adam's paper and everything. So, all right, take care.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books Today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.